Good evening. I'm Blythe McCarthy, the Andrew W. Mellon Senior Scientist at the National Museum of Asian Art, and I'd like to welcome you tonight. We're happy to have you here for a series of talks on the Washington Gospels. Thank you all for coming, and I'd now like to briefly introduce our speakers. For the first talk, it will be given by Chase Robinson. Chase has been director of the National Museum of Asian Art since December of 2018. During his tenure, the museum has launched initiatives that have significantly increased the number of visitors on site and online, expanded the collections by over 5,400 works, built out its network of community-based and international partnerships, established itself as the forefront of provenance research, and nearly doubled the size of its board of trustees. A highly regarded scholar of Islamic history and culture, Director Robinson has delved into the history and reception of the Washington Gospels, initiating the Washington Gospels Project, and we'll hear about that from him tonight. Following that, the next talk will be started by Rhea DeStefano, who is a paper conservator at the National Museum of Asian Art, where she cares for works on paper and parchment. Rhea has been spearheading the codicological research on the Washington Gospels project that she will discuss tonight. Working with her has been Kesha Talbert, who is also a paper conservator at the National Museum of Asian Art, where she works with art on paper, parchment, and photographs. She's been working on measurements of parchment dimensions for the Washington Gospel Project. The third talk will be given by Jiří Vnouček, who is a senior researcher and conservator at the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen, where he has worked since 2005. He combines visual assessment of parchment and early manuscripts with insights gained from his own experimental parchment making and conservation practice. He's currently a member of the research teams of two large European multidisciplinary projects on early manuscripts, the Insular and the Codex project. In his study of the Washington Gospels, he's applying his knowledge of parchment making techniques and the anatomical study of animals gained from his vast previous experience. So after the three talks, we'll have a brief Q&A, and then we hope our on-site audience will join us upstairs to continue the conversation with the speakers in a reception. And now to begin, I'd like to welcome Director Robinson to the stage to give us a glimpse into his research on Rhea and the Washington Gospels.
Thank you so much, Blythe. It's a great pleasure to be here. Welcome to those of you who are on site to the National Museum of Asian Art, which, as my colleagues will know, I never fail to advertise as America's first national art museum. And welcome to the Meyer Auditorium in the Freer Gallery of Art, which was made possible by America's first great art benefactor, Charles Lang Freer. Our mission statement. It is a great pleasure for me today to speak about this project, still incipient, provisional, finding its way, but a project that speaks to our mission. It's one, I'm very proud to say, that not only highlights the terrific work of our conservation department, but one that reflects the promise of a multidisciplinary approach: history, art history, conservation, paleography, codicology, scientific analysis, all of which can and will converge in the understanding of an object in our collection. My role tonight, and I say this genuinely, is modest. It being shortly after 5, I am going to serve as a kind of appetizer. I'm going to serve to frame out some historical context, which I hope will whet your appetites for the detailed, descriptive, and analytical work that will follow the meal proper. The first course will be delivered by Rhea and Kesha, as Blythe described, and perhaps the main course by Jiří. My great desire has been to unite modern work with masterpieces of a certain period of high civilization, harmonious in spiritual suggestion, having the power to broaden aesthetic culture, and the grace to elevate the human mind. So wrote Freer in 1904 in a letter he wrote to the then Secretary of the Smithsonian. By 1906, he had entered into a gift agreement to give his collection to the US government, along with funds sufficient to build this glorious building. At Freer's death in 1919, his collection had grown to nearly 10,000 pieces, housed in the gallery that would bear his name, and open in May of 1923. The man himself never had the opportunity to see the building. Born in 1854 in Kingston, New York, in the most modest of circumstances, by 1880, Freer had moved to the then booming industrial, even entrepreneurial city of Detroit, where he gained partial ownership in a railway car manufacturing firm. A monopolist with a keen eye for efficiencies, cost containment, and the power of scale in the brutally competitive market, in 1900, Freer stepped away from management, a very wealthy man, to concentrate his time, his energies, and his resources to building his collection of art, particularly the work of a small number of contemporary American painters, and the much larger project of assembling a foundational collection of Asian art. A few short months after formalizing his gift agreement with the Smithsonian in 1906, Freer began a concentrated series of tours of the Near East and Asia that would let up only in 1911. Now, biblical texts make up a tiny fraction of the collection that he donated to the Freer Gallery, which would number, as I said, just short of 10,000 pieces at the time of his death. Our collection now numbering about 48,000 pieces, that fraction has grown all the smaller over the last century. But as Larry Hurtado has put it, the biblical works in our collection, quote, comprise one of the most important collections of such items in the world. One, and we're going to be consistent in our nomenclature, was and remains of perhaps singular value. Written in the Indo-European language of Greek and apparently manufactured in the northeast corner of Africa, the Washington Gospels is unarguably one of the most important objects in a museum renowned for its collection of Asian fine arts. Now, for biblical scholars, it's had singular value because it was thought to illuminate murky 4th and 5th century world of biblical manuscripts when Christians were at the tail end of forming the New Testament. Like other examples of the period, the Washington Gospels preserves what scholars call the Western order of Gospels, Matthew, John, Luke, Mark, which differs from the now standard Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, in 1906, when the Washington Gospels were discovered, I should put that in quotation marks, they seemed to reveal something very important about one gospel, in particular, the Gospel of Mark. In this respect, it was nothing less than a sensation. Scholars had already shown that Mark, which was probably written in the 60s or 70s AD, was the earliest of the 4 Gospels, the source of material that was taken up by authors of Matthew and Luke, and presumptively the closest to the historical Jesus. In many respects, Mark was and remains the most elusive of the four Gospels, and what's especially curious about it is what the great majority of scholars understand to have been its original abrupt ending. Quote, the greatest of all literary mysteries, as one put it. Alone among the Gospels, Mark fails to provide a witness to Jesus' resurrection. The Washington Gospels, it seemed, solved this problem. As early as February of 1908, scholarship was drawing attention to a signal feature of the text of what is generally speaking regarded as a 4th or 5th century text, what scholars have come to call the Freer Logion, a passage that otherwise unattested in the earliest codices, but known to Jerome, provides an alternative and fuller ending. There we read that the apostles excused themselves to a resurrected Jesus, saying that an age of lawless and unbelief remains under Satan. Jesus replies ambiguously, saying that the time of Satan was over, but that other terrible things were drawing near. And for those who have sinned, I was delivered over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, in order that they may inherit the spiritual and incorruptible glory of justice, which is in heaven. A particular favorite picture of mine, Freer is a kind of T.S. Lawrence before the fact, pith-helmeted discoverer. We congratulate American scholars that at last there is in this country one great ancient witness to the Greek text of the New Testament, wrote Goodspeed in 1908. America now had the opportunity to make its own mark in biblical scholarship. The manuscripts are evidently of great interest and great importance, and I congratulate you and your country heartily on their acquisition, wrote the British paleographer and biblical scholar Frederick Kenyon in the same year to Freer in a letter. America, of course, was then taking an imperial turn, and it had acquired biblical manuscripts that could rival the imperial powers of Europe. Like Freer's great benefaction itself, the story tapped into national insecurities about America's standing in the still Eurocentric competition for the cultural prestige that trophies of empire could deliver. In bringing the Washington Gospels and other biblical manuscripts to America, Freer was thus becoming a world-class patron for a still uncultured country. Just as Russia, Great Britain, France, and the Vatican could boast early biblical manuscripts, now, finally, America. In a battle for global prestige and power that the United States had only recently joined, the press portrayed Freer as that intrepid explorer of ancient lands. His happy find, as it was put, the Washington Gospels, arguably his most significant trophy. Now, how did this find take place? And what in the project that we're undertaking can we make of it? The Christological or theological impact of the Washington Gospels may have waned over the last century, but the object remains remarkable in other respects. One is that we can tell the story of its acquisition. Freer's diaries and correspondence allow us to follow closely his movements and impressions on this, his first visit to Egypt. Of course, in an age before air conditioning, winter was the time to make the journey. Traveling with his decades-long friend and physician, Freddie Mann, Freer left New York City on the 15th of November of 1906. Sailing via Naples, they arrived in the port of Alexandria on December 8th and left for Cairo by train the next day. Freer spent the first 2 weeks of his stay residing in the Shepherd's Hotel, a monument to colonial-era comfort and luxury. Facing the Ezbekiya Gardens, the hotel was at the heart of a new modern Cairo, the well-ordered European quarter of the millennium-old city. Mr. Morgan's caravansary is how one contemporary and a companion of J.P. Morgan called the Shepherds, the very center of traveldom, where dealers thronged about, making their wares available to tourists and collectors such as Freer. Nowadays, Cairo extends well to the west, enveloping the pyramid complex in Giza. In 1906, Giza still remained a rural settlement, although an electric tram service opened in 1899, reducing the once difficult trip to about a 40-minute ride. Freer made what seems to have been his first reconnaissance trip to Giza on December 14th, probably by taxi. Cairo to the pyramids and surroundings, antiquarians, lunch at Hotel Minas, he noted in his diary. And on the 15th, Cairo, Arabic Library and Museum, the precursor to the Islamic Museum, antiquarians, and the Badgers, some social friends of Freer's. From his diary on the 16th, where antiquarian appears for the first time in the singular, we can infer that he'd begun to focus his attention on a single dealer. Cairo, with antiquarian and prof all day. For the 18th, Cairo, museum afternoon, all forenoon and evening with Greek priests at house of ellipsis. Frank Hecker, a long friend and very close business associate, indeed partner of Freer's. On the 19th, Freer puts in his diary, Cairo, bought manuscripts in forenoon and paid for them during afternoon. Freer corresponded regularly with his friend and business associate, Hecker, and on the 19th, he began a letter to Hecker before breaking off to make the purchase. It must have been that time of the day, between two visits to the dealer. I fully intended, he tells Hecker, to resist all temptation, but the manuscripts carried me completely off my feet, and after 2 days of examination assisted by 2 Greek scholars, I fell by the wayside. I'm giving you a glimpse of the documentary material that we have in our archives and which facilitates all of this research. We have an invoice dated December 19th that documents that Freer paid £1,600 for the purchase of 4 biblical manuscripts. Now, 6 days later, Freer left Cairo for Upper Egypt to tour its sites, returning to Cairo on January 16th, when he went back to the dealer that did more buying. And on the 21st of January, he departed on an 11 a.m. train for Port Said, where he would embark on a ship for what was then called Ceylon, Sri Lanka. Who sold Freer the manuscripts? The dealer is usually identified in the literature as Ali Arabi or Ali Arabi. Freer himself would sometimes write of Old Arabi in a not-so-little condescension. Later, Freer would write that he was, quote, an amusing but still useful agent who has done me many kindnesses, notwithstanding he has always made me pay well for them. His proper name, in shortened form, and I won't walk you through my best guess of how he saw himself, the name that he used, was Ali el-Gabri. 2 photographs memorialize Freer's visit to Cairo and his business with el-Gabri. Both were curated, one might say, to project a particular vision of American-Egyptian encounter. The photos were taken by Paul Dittrich, arguably Cairo's leading establishment photographer in the 1880s and 1890s. The sitting seems to have taken place sometime between January 16th, when Freer had returned to Cairo, and the 21st, when he left for South Asia. Carefully staged, the pyramidal profile of four men in the foreground echoes the two pyramids painted on the draped background. To the left, the two foreigners, Freddie Mann and Freer, sit, both wearing their hats as if outdoors. Mann's bowler hat seems to signify that he's all business, working in his capacity as Freer's physician. Freer himself wears a rather more summery boater hat. He's a moneyed man at leisure. Ibrahim Ali, El-Gabri's son, and Freer's guide and translator, stands respectfully, even solicitously, wearing a Western suit and tarbouche. He represents a modernizing generation. And in this, of course, he contrasts with his father El-Gabri, who wears traditional Bedouin garb and clutches a shisha or a hookah. What El-Gabri exudes is a kind of venerable gravitas. Unlike his son, whose standing posture signals respect, El-Gabri sits, commanding Freer's attention, his equal. On the left, he stares, expressionless on the camera, but on the right, El-Gabri and Freer shake hands as if consummating a deal, say, the purchase of some antiquities. For Freer, the photograph obviously served as a keepsake, the source of pleasing reminiscence of his trip to Egypt, especially the forging of a business relationship that he would value well until his death, until 1919. For El-Gabri, it would also serve as a calling card for the nature of his partners in business, the nature of his clientele. Now, there's no reason to think that Freer arrived in Egypt with the intention of acquiring biblical manuscripts. He was largely, if not entirely, self-taught. It seems that he dabbled a bit in language learning, but he never developed competency in French or German, much less in Chinese, Japanese, Greek, or Coptic. While other buyers were looking for material of scholarly merit, papyrology was already a well-developed field at the turn of the 20th century, and the critical study of biblical manuscripts was even older. Freer's interests were at this point mainly aesthetic and focused on ceramics. And so, little wonder, he narrates his decision to purchase the manuscripts in emphatically aesthetic terms. "The beautiful writing first attracted my attention," he wrote. 2 years later, he went to some pains to emphasize that his reaction to the manuscripts was instinctive rather than learned. How, in particular, they made his back crawl and produced creeps along my spine. Evidently, the double portraits painted on its wood-boarded presumptive front and back, which postdate the manuscript, struck him. It's also little wonder that Freer succumbed to some buyer's remorse. Writing to Hecker on January 20th, he describes his stay as most instructive and agreeable in many ways, but the business practices here are shocking. I have bought a few things and have struck some pretty tough men. Honor in business affairs is unknown, and many others of the traits in mankind which we in America are taught to admire here are entirely unseen. Due to his, by his own admission, ignorance and credulity, I might have been swindled. The fact is, Freer was operating in something of a wild west of Egyptian antiquities trading. There, amongst scrupulous and unscrupulous dealers, expert and naive purchasers, not to mention state officials who took bribes or looked the other way, genuine finds were mixed with forged and pastiche objects. Pseudo-hoards were assembled from separate find spots. Items were discovered items and objects in any number of ways found their way into the hands of dealers who worked wherever tourists, collectors, and dealers could be found. The picture on the slide is of a pastiche piece that was sold under false pretenses to Freer. Now, the village of Kafr al-Haram, the center where Ali al-Ghabri did business, was a major hub of smuggling, of looting, and much more besides. The village's inhabitants, quote, carrying on an almost systematic series of illicit excavations, as one observer described it. And at or near the center of Kafr al-Haram was al-Ghabri, the dealer so instrumental in forming Freer's access to Egyptian antiquities. Freer may or may not have understood al-Ghabri's infamous, by then clearly infamous reputation, or for that matter, the very compromised nature of the trade that was going on in Kafr al-Haram. What he certainly understood was that navigating the safe passage of his objects out of Egypt required careful attention. On the 17th of January, he contacted the American Consul General, and on the 20th, his last full day in Cairo, he made his way to the Egyptian Museum and met with its keeper, a German Egyptologist and photographer who, overseeing export authorization, functioned as a kind of facilitator of trade, connecting dealers and museums with potential buyers. It's a hellish place to do business, Freer wrote to his friend and office manager, J.M. Kennedy, in a 10-page letter he wrote on January 18th or 19th, which was dedicated largely to the shipping arrangements he was putting in place. Now, if Freer had the knowledge, resources, and connections to move his purchases out of Egypt and Ottoman Syria, he certainly could not have then known that he was operating in the twilight of Egypt's still under-regulated antiquities trade. The export of antiquities had been the subject of legislation since 1835, but loopholes, laxness, and official connivance diluted its impact. It would be in 1912, a few years later, and only after decades of opportunism and plundering, that a thorough revision of that law was promulgated. Antiquities, now defined for the first time, belong to the public, that law stated, and excavations, along with the sale and export of objects, were made subject to authorization and licensing. Dodgy dealing would scarcely end in 1912. Even stricter laws were put in place in 1951. Nor would smuggling, which regrettably continues to this day. But the days of grossly conspicuous illicit buying and selling were coming to a close. It's no coincidence that after 1912, al-Ghabri and the traders of Kafr al-Haram fade from the historical record. When were the manuscripts first unearthed and brought to market? The possibilities seem to range from no earlier than 1895 to a few months before they were offered to Freer in December of 1906. Sanders, the first scholar to examine the manuscripts closely, argued that they had been freshly disinterred from a burial spot. In such a ruined monastery or in some other hiding place of the desert sand, the manuscripts were found probably in 1906, so he wrote. For the desert sand still filled the wrinkles and was encrusted on the exterior when I began to work on them. As far as the find spot is concerned, the obvious candidates are sites that had documented Christian settlements, especially Coptic monasteries, which were the centers for the production of biblical manuscripts. The eligible candidates, however, are all over the map, such as Dimay, which lies about 90 kilometers southeast of Cairo, and Giza itself, but there are many, many more. I will conclude. Freer's project was to edify on a national scale. The project undertaken by biblical scholars then and continuing now is largely textual, to recover the earliest layers of Christian thought and belief. the project that we're embarking upon is complementary. Some terminology that might be helpful to those who succeed me to the podium. The Washington Gospels is a codex, plural codices, the precursor to what we would now call a book. That is, pages or leaves, in this case made of parchment, processed animal skin, bound together and accompanied, as I've said, by two painted wood covers, which, though now separated, would have enclosed the leaves on the front and the back. This codex is thus an example of late antique information technology. Superior to clay tablets or book rolls, that is, scrolls, the codex superseded during the 3rd and 4th centuries, the scroll, in no small part because Christians favored it for scripture. Imagine, and of course this comment is occasioned by the release of some version of the iPhone, I don't keep track. Imagine that an iPhone were discovered, unearthed, say in the year 2500. We might try to reconstruct the information that it preserved digitally, the text that it contained. And that might be clear or it might be corrupted, and we might need parallel text or linguistic data to understand its content, the text that it preserved. We might also try to reconstruct its ownership. The phone might have been purchased in Washington, D.C., or Paris or New York. It might have been stolen, it might have been mislaid, it might have been returned and then recycled for use elsewhere, as is frequently the case with phones. Finally, we might try to reconstruct its manufacture and indeed its afterlife. What was it made of? How was it assembled? How did this piece of technology work? Where and when were its components made? Was its screen repaired? Was it upgraded? These are the kinds of questions that my colleagues are asking by deploying, in the case of the Washington Gospels, analytical approaches such as radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, proteomics, and imaging techniques such as micro-CT scanning and hyperspectral imaging. We've only begun. I now turn to my colleagues to describe their work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chase. Good evening, everyone. Oops. There we go. My colleague Kesha Talbert and I are delighted to be sharing our work on the technical examination of the Washington Gospels with you tonight. Over the past year since embarking on this project, our focus has been on close visual examination of the Codex. This work has been enriched by the collaboration of our internal team, curators, scientists, and conservators, as well as through study visits from external specialists, including Dr. Vnouček, who is joining us today. These visits have been a privilege and a valuable opportunity to deepen our understanding of the manuscript, particularly in relation to the history and complexities of parchment production, book history, codicology, and digital humanities. These interdisciplinary perspectives have helped shape our research questions and inform our approach as we work to contextualize the Washington Gospels within the broader landscape of the handful of surviving codices from this period. I now invite you to step into the world of the physical object, the Codex. The term codex, as Chase has already described, derives from caudex, which translates from Latin as tree trunk or block of wood, and refers to the tablets composed of one or more leaves connected by sewing, as you can see in this rendering. The codex is later designated by the gathering of sheets of papyrus or parchment. According to Dr. Georgios Boudalis, the Codex was a Roman innovation, one of the latest examples of Roman ingenuity, and I quote, certainly one of the most important for the history of civilization. During Greco-Roman antiquity, the papyrus roll was the standard format for extended written texts. Boudalis notes that the wooden tablet codex gradually evolved, first from wooden leaves to papyrus and parchment, and eventually into the book format as we recognize it today. This new format was especially embraced by early Christians whose rapidly spreading religion across the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and Europe helped establish the Codex as a standard book form, gradually replacing the roll. In this slide, you see a map illustrating the spread of Christianity from around 300 to 800, highlighting the expansion of monastic communities. This time frame aligns with the estimated origins of the Washington Gospels Codex, and although the origin of its later discovery is unclear, it is believed to have originated from a monastery in the west bank of the Nile in northern Egypt. The Washington Gospels is currently dated to the late 4th to early 5th century and stands among the few surviving examples of late antique biblical texts preserved in a bound, multi-gathering codex format with wooden board covers. The small format manuscript written on parchment, measuring circa 20.5 centimeters in height and 14.8 centimeters in width, comprises 27 gatherings, mostly formed from 4 folded sheets, each sewn through the center of the fold. These gatherings total 372 pages of text, written in a single column in brown uncial script, a writing style commonly used during this period. On this slide, you can observe the book's spine, where evidence of original sewing stations are visible, and remnants of dark leather suggest a former spine covering that once connected the text block to its wooden board covers. Remarkably, over the past century, the Washington Gospels has been largely spared from destructive examination and invasive conservation treatments. This makes it an invaluable resource for historians, conservators, and scientists, offering rare insights into early codex construction and the late craftsmanship of late antiquity. Although the exact location of its discovery in the late 19th century remains uncertain, it is widely believed to have been found in Egypt, a region dominated by arid desert conditions. Likely buried in sand for centuries, the manuscript shows signs of both deterioration and preservation. While the desert environment may have caused heat-related damage, it also protected the codex from moisture and biological decay. The most significant damage is visible on the outer leaves and along the foredge of the text block. As shown in this slide, the foredge is extremely fragile and brittle, with pronounced darkening of the parchment, suggesting prolonged exposure to heat. This area requires careful handling and special attention during examination to prevent further loss. In the left image, we see the spine view of the text block with remnants of leather that have hardened and are very rigid. The parchment gatherings are still attached to the leather in those areas, restricting opening angle of those pages when consulting the manuscript. You can also see evidence of the sewing stations. The first 4 sewing stations are evenly distributed to the width of the page. The 5th station at the bottom is pushed very close to the edge of the page, possibly an indication this was added during later resewing of the book. The original 4 sewing stations would have been reused, and for strength, the 5th station would have been added. On the right image, we see a rendering by Theodore Peterson, who studied this manuscript between the 1930s and 50s, of the possible link-stitch sewing with 2 needles and double thread. The Washington Gospels retain 2 wooden board covers, each cut nearly flush to the dimensions of the text block and beveled along the outer edges. These covers are no longer physically connected to the text block. You can also note the chain attachment to the top edge of each wooden board. The function and purpose of these chains remain unclear to us at this time. The boards are adorned with portraits of the 4 evangelists, Matthew and John on the front cover to your left, and Luke and Mark on the back cover to your right. These figures were rendered using an encaustic painting technique common in Roman Egypt, in which pigments were mixed with beeswax and other ingredients and applied either warm or cold onto the wooden surface. The encaustic painting is very likely to have been added at a later time. I will get to this in a later slide. Here you see the interior of the wooden boards, where parchment is fully adhered to the interior wood boards, the so-called paste downs. These paste downs were originally connected to the last leaf of the first and last gathering, and possibly adhered to the wooden board covers at a later time. The 26 holes, a remarkable number for the size of the cover, along both spine edges of the wooden boards were used to connect spine leather to board, anchoring strips of tapering leather laced through the spine edge onto the inside of the board, some holes still showing remnants of leather in their cavities. The remnants of leather could provide us with clues on how the leather might have been prepared and shaped to attach the board, and we plan to perform analysis to better understand the technique employed. Here you see the holes present along the top edge of the top board cover, possibly to anchor leather wrapping straps. These holes are also present along the front edge of the same top board cover. These straps would have been wrapped 2 to 3 times around the book and locked in place with bone appendages that were wedged into place between the leather straps. A comparable binding from that time period, the Glacier Codex, is the most complete example of the type, originated in Egypt and also from around the 4th or 5th century. It also features wrapping straps and bone slips, elements we believe are evidenced in the Washington Codex. The model here shows how the leather straps would have been attached on the board edges and wrapped around the book using the bone slips at the end to anchor the straps into place. This codex retains its original wooden boards still connected to the text block and a decorated leather spine, and is distinguished by a unique leather extension designed to protect the manuscript's top edge. The Almudil Psalter from the same time period was also found in Egypt, in a large necropolis south of Cairo in the 80s, and shows similar features seen in the Glacier Codex and the Washington Gospels in how the boards were prepared for wrapped straps. We can see in this drawing of the Washington Gospels by Peterson how the straps would have been attached to the board. It brings forth doubt that the original craftsman who created the covers would have conceived the binding with the painted portraits. Furthermore, the inconsistent way in which the yellow color is overlaid on top of some of the holes for the leather straps along the edges further emphasizes that the paintings were unlikely to have been completed at the time of the original binding, and rather were executed once the straps had already separated from the covers. The Washington Gospels and its biblical text have been documented since the early 20th century, with foundational scholarship beginning in 1912 and continuing through modern digitization efforts. As we heard from Chase earlier, shortly after the Codex's acquisition in 1906 and its arrival from Egypt to Detroit, the home of Charles Lang Freer, he enlisted papyrologist Henry Sanders from the University of Michigan Special Collections. Sanders conducted an extensive study of the manuscript, culminating in a 1912 publication that included a separate volume featuring a fine collotype facsimile of the entire codex, as you can see here. This reproduction has been essential to our work. It allows us to minimize handling of the original, maintain the manuscript's correct foliation, and compare historical images to assess condition changes over time, providing a valuable reference point for both conservation and scholarly research. At this point, the Washington Gospels lies open for new and improved scientific analysis, given the current developments of non-invasive and minimally invasive techniques. Thanks to federal support we have received this year from the Smithsonian Collections Care and Preservation Fund, we are preparing to pursue advanced imaging and reconstruction techniques to deepen our understanding of the Washington Gospels. In collaboration with the National Museum of Natural History, we are conducting a series of microcomputed tomography, also known as micro-CT, scans to investigate possible sewing remnants beneath the leather spine covering. Micro-CT scanning is a non-destructive X-ray imaging technique using X-rays to generate detailed, high-resolution 3D and 2D images of an object's internal structure. To prepare for these scans, we will run test scans using a mock-up of the text block, as you can see in this slide, and a piece of comparable hardwood. We will be testing different materials to be used to mount the object on a rotating stand in the scanner to ensure the safest and most effective setup. A separate scan will focus on the wooden covers, aiming to visualize the internal grain structure and tool marks to help identify the wood species used in the original binding. In collaboration with the University of Western Ontario and Toronto, we will process the resulting micro-CT datasets to generate a 2D and 3D rendering of the Codex's internal structure. As part of our grant-funded research, we are collaborating with the University of Leuven in Belgium to conduct photometric stereo imaging, a technique that captures surface detail and topography by analyzing how light interacts with the object from multiple angles using different light sources. With imaging of the parchment surface, we will record subtle features such as irregularities and preparation marks from the skin production, as well as ruling lines and pricking marks that were used to prepare the skin for writing. With imaging of the ink, we will be able to record corrections in the text and possibly make observations on the writing implement used for this manuscript. These high-resolution surface maps will support both conservation analysis and digital reconstruction efforts, contributing to a deeper understanding of the Codex's material history and craftsmanship. And finally, as part of our grant-funded research, we are working with book conservator Christine Manwiller at the National Museum of African American History and Culture to create a high-fidelity physical model of the Washington Gospels using historically comparable materials and techniques. This reconstruction will include working with one of the few remaining traditional parchment makers, recreating a full set of parchment leaves that are being commissioned to construct a complete model. I'm pleased that Jiří has offered to recreate a few gatherings of parchment using historically accurate methods consistent with parchment production of that era. Jiří's parchment will serve as a tactile and visual reference, allowing us to see, feel, and study a historically faithful reproduction of the material. Wooden covers will be reconstructed using wood species identified through the micro-CT analysis, shaped and beveled to match the original boards. The sewing structure will be recreated based on the current study and material evidence revealed out of the micro-CT screenings of the original Codex. This reconstruction of the Codex will also serve as a research tool and interpretive model supporting conservation planning codicological study, and public engagement with the material history of the Washington Gospels. As we move into the next phase of this multifaceted project, we are preparing to convene a select group of scientists to help refine our research questions. This convening will contribute to establishing a clear order of inquiry, allowing research to unfold in tandem with conservation and stabilization efforts. A dedicated convening on conservation efforts will follow, bringing together specialists to guide the next steps in preserving the Codex.
As Rhea has mentioned, one of the initial portions of this project has been to document not only the condition of the Codex, but also the observations made thus far about the materials and construction via diagrams, photo documentation, and notes. Last September, parchment specialist Dr. Jiří Vnouček conducted an initial exam of the Codex here at NMAA. During this time, our first page-by-page examination was made, resulting in a description of the collation and notes on specific features of the parchment. He will share his observations in the following presentation, especially as it relates to the parchment. But for now, we will focus on the data collected over the past year and how it can inform our investigations going further. A handwritten diagram of the collation was created as part of our initial exam, which you see here. A digital model of the collation will be developed using the Viscol system as the project continues. This preliminary diagram also included notes about features of the parchment and areas of interest for additional study. For instance, the orientation of the hair and flesh sides to one another, the presence of axilla, which is a patterning of the thin skin around the legs of the animal, which helps us to determine the orientation of the spine. The presence of ruling lines and or pricking to aid the scribes in spacing and alignment. Instances of what we're referring to as efflorescence, which is a white crystalline material emerging through the hair side surface of the parchment from the tissue beneath. And then general observations of the appearance or feel of the parchment, such as color, thickness, and stiffness. To aggregate this information in a format that helps identify trends, facilitate the addition of subsequent information, and guide the selection of areas of focus for future study or testing, we've created the spreadsheet. While the diagrams remain indispensable as a visual aid, documenting the parchment and construction using this spreadsheet format also allows us to group and evaluate the data in meaningful ways. The next large data collection was to systematically measure the thickness of each page. 18 measurements were taken with a digital micrometer along the perimeter of each bifolio, where possible, as you see in the diagram here. The setup was rather straightforward for detached individual pages, a bit more complex for intact bifolia that were loose from the binding, and rather challenging for bifolia held in the bound format by adhesive and leather remnants on the spine. For these pages attached to the spine remnants, we were only able to collect a few measurements along the foredge and perhaps the outermost position at head or tail. Maneuvering the tool inside the allowable opening of the text block was really pretty difficult. This level of data collection, though, provides us not only with numerous point measurements for each page, but a statistically significant average thickness for each bifolia and the average thickness of the parchment in each gathering, which we recorded in two separate ways here and then here by gathering. During this second pass through the text, we also made a diagram of the extant sewing threads located in the center of the gatherings. As you will see, there is no line in areas where the thread is missing entirely, and then either 1, 2, or 3 lines signifying threads in the positions we observed them. Our most recent data collection has been to take color measurements of a select number of pages with the NIXT Spectro 2 spectrophotometer. This instrument has a 2 millimeter detector and 31 spectral data channels from 400 to 700 nanometers. The NIXT products are marketed primarily for quality control applications in design and manufacturing, and are therefore much smaller and more nimble than other styles of colorimeters or spectrophotometers. However, it's still too large to safely position in areas of limited access. Therefore, we targeted the collection points to folios that were more accessible, but still represented a range of tones as described in our initial visual observations recorded in our spreadsheet. At least 2 bifolia were measured from each of the 4 Gospels, which comprise the text block. This framework of information and the various formats in which we present and study it will be useful not only for the construction and condition documentation, but will also aid in determining the areas of interest or features which would warrant further analytical study, which will be guided by the upcoming scientific convening that Rhea mentioned. There's still much information to collect before a comprehensive analysis and reporting on this codex can be shared. However, in the next presentation, Dr. Vnouček will discuss how the data collected thus far, coupled with his practical knowledge of the materials, has already contributed to a greater understanding of the parchment of this manuscript.
Good evening. I feel very honored to be invited here to have a chance to work on this fascinating gospel. And I'm very excited about the work which was presented by my colleagues and also the historical outlook about the Rhea. And in my talk, which is coming, I would like to focus on media. I really like when Chase was showing this iPhone and the scroll. So this is the writing medium of the late antique period, parchment. And parchment gospel is one of several gospels which are written, well, not several, well, from this period, definitely several, but the late antique period, from late antique period is preserved quite a few other codexes, not specifically biblical only, and I had the chance to study them during the last 20 years, and to compare my results with the observation I made on the Washington Gospels, and also, as was announced, with my experience with the parchment making when I was trying to reconstruct the actual method, how the parchment was made. So, what do we know about the late Pontic parchment, or about the methods which were used, how to produce it? Well, we definitely know from Pliny that here is the Acropole of Pergama, now today Bergama in Turkey, but ancient Pergamon, which is coined for the first production of the parchment. However, the information in Pliny is almost, I would say, think nothing, because this text actually, which is always cited as the invention of parchment, is only last paragraph of the description of production of papyrus. We don't have in Pliny description of how parchment was made at the late antique times. So it's just what is relevant is really that it says it was discovered in Pergamon, but of course we know that the parchment as a writing media was already used some time before. So it seems that it was maybe improved in such a way that it was possible to produce in large quantities. And the only clearer description comes from John Lidus, which is a bit later, as you can see, and he mentioned that the shaved sheep hides, the thin ones, were supplied by the Romans, and after that, place of origin were called Pergamena. We also know that there are some images or even sculptures, or in this case mosaic, of sheep. So we can see it's a long-tailed, thick, long-tailed sheep. However, it's really interesting. We've seen how the historical the scholars who look at the history or texture or the text of the manuscript, they hardly touch the problem of the parchment. In the facsimile, which was mentioned here several times from 1912, there's a few lines about the parchment, which says that it's quite yellow. It seems to be sheep with possible some goat parchment as well. However, they haven't written anything about a possible technology, how this parchment could be made. And they even haven't described or noticed various patches, holes, and other imperfections, which are really the lead in my work, because that's the way how you can observe and study this kind of material. You can't really learn anything from perfect parchment. It's interesting that even in the catalog of the exhibition from 2006 and 7, edited by Michel Brown, there is almost nothing said about parchment. So you can see even in the modern history it was still not interest. However, I can say I'm really pleased that during the last couple of years there was the explosion of the interest about the study of parchment and the methods of how is it made. So how does the parchment of Washington Gospel look like? I have to say first at this point that all the images is Washington Gospel. I'm not showing any other manuscripts. But because I wanted to use the space, I didn't include the description on every bifolio. So please, this is all Washington Gospel. And it's the first image just show the same bifolio from the hair side and the flesh side. And you can see that indeed the hair side is slightly yellowish, while the flesh side is quite nicely white. And as it was mentioned, the thickness of the parchment is about 1.5 micrometers. So it's very thin. It's very thin material, and it's not me. That's good. That's quite positive. And right. And how this was made. If we look very carefully about the edges of margins and of the folia, we can actually observe, and that's really great offer, I would say, from Washington Gospel, some places where the process of preparation of parchment is incomplete. And not only that, which is in our case here, and we call this a peeling of surface of parchment when the whole grain layer, epidermis, with the rectangular part of the dermis is also removed. But we can also see actually the patches which were used from the same material to secure that there will be no destruction during the process. Now, how this is possible? How is this happening? I have this image. I apologize, the left one is slightly blurry, but which shows what's happening with the structure of the sheepskin. I have to say most or almost all late antique codices are written on sheep parchment. Now, what is interesting to say about, nobody really noticed it. And even in most of the catalogs were written that's the vellum, which is supposed to be calf parchment. However, the vellum became widely used for the fine quality of the parchment. But that's, as you can see, not true. Even the sheep parchment can be very high quality. So how it happened? It can only happen because the natural structure of the skin, sheepskin. You can see that here is the upper layer, epidermis and upper part, and that's the dermis. And there is a gap in between, which is filled with the fat lipices, which are sort of making a barrier or the layer which is possible to remove. On this, and it's not happening with the calf skin or goat skin. So when you see peeled manuscript, you can almost certainly say that's the sheepskin. So here is an interesting structure made by Ronald Reed, and which shows you, as I mentioned, this is of course not supposed to show the peeling, it's just supposed to show the structure, but I really like to see, you can see the epidermis, which is mostly destroyed and consumed during the process of the in the lime, where the hairs are going to be removed. But the residues of the epidermis with so-called papillary rectangular dermis actually form the layer. I start to use the term epidermis, but I have to say it's not exact, so I just try to make it clear. So actually in this junction, it's possible to split parchment. Well, I've been making the parchment for many years, and of course, most of the thing you find, there are no recipes, as I mentioned in this case, And so I randomly found that you can split or peel the sheep. And then, of course, when I've seen and studied this type of manuscripts, I realized that that's the way how the parchment was manufactured. So here you can see the lime. I'm using lime system, the slaked lime, which is used for dehairing of the removal of it eases the removal of the hairs, and it also saponizes the fat, so it can the skin can be nicely clean on both sides, as you can see here in the middle picture, and then of course stretching of the parchment on the frame. Now, the most important part happened that you can start to lift the upper layer, however we will call it, and remove it. Now, what is really interesting, and I have to stress it, that you can never remove the whole thing. So you are sort of removing the small pieces. Sometimes you manage to remove larger one. Sometimes you struggle a lot. You can see that here is the black sheep, the residues of the black hair, and these are completely going to be disappeared when the peeling is completed. So that's the way how it makes this parchment perfectly equal on both sides. When you peel the surface, there is this fat layer which can be cleaned. And after all these parts of the process are finished, nothing else is done. You just leave the parchment, which is, just for your information, approximately about the thickness of your program. You just let it dry, and you don't do anything on the surface, and you even cannot do, because you would damage the surface and get the hole through. So here you can see the comparison of the different thicknesses. One of them here, its full thickness, which is magically 137. I already mentioned the 0130 is the Washington Gospel. And here you can see in the thin areas, where is it splitted? It's 0.87 in this case, but it can go up, down to 45, for example. So when here in the middle, you can see like a halfly peeled, so you can see that you get the residue, which is usually I was just for throwing it away, but then I put it in the bucket of the water, and it was nicely floating in the bucket. So I could lift it with my hand, and I realized that that's the material which actually cover the holes. So these patches are work of the parchment maker, not additional repairs by the scribes. It's a part of the process of parchment making. And here you can see the example how this look like on wet parchment, then dry stage, and then when it's complete, transmitted light, you can even hardly see it. So sometimes it's and this layer, it's so thin that when it's get lost, you can hardly even see there was any patch before. So this, I would say, is the very special technology which is typical for the late antique parchment making, and which is absolutely true in the case of Washington Gospels. So let's now see how we can observe these features on this very manuscript. You can see I immediately put the one which has a very large hole. We will get to see it. However, our first attention should be paid to the peeling. And as I say, I'm speaking about incomplete peeling. Now, question is, you might ask, why incomplete? Well, because you start, let's say, to peel from the center, and which is relatively thick of the skin, and you peel down to the edges where the skin, like axilla or belly if you want, or armpits is, and it gets so weak that by the peeling the holes can start to appear. So what happened, and what happened to me also, you have to stop immediately, and if the hole appears, you have to grab your patch and put it back the same way as it was taken away, of course, to a different place, right? But it's always, the patches are always coming on the hair side, back the same kind of position. And the ground compound substance is making perfect adhesion. You don't need any additional adhesive. Anyway, but first a little bit focus on the peeling itself. So here, in this case, you can see that you don't necessarily can peel only one layer, you can peel different layers. So here, it's completely white. Here, it's something in between, and this is the unpeeled part. I really specifically like this one, which you can see was stopped again in the area which was close to the edge where the axilla was, and here the same. You can see it in the details. You can see the kind of barrier where it's this part is peeled, and this one, sorry, opposite. This one is peeled, the white, and the other one is unpeeled. And you can see it also in connection with the text, which give you the idea about the scale. Right, now we have a very interesting case also in Washington Gospel, which is technologically very interesting because it's a bit hard to recognize, but I put even the image in transmitting light, which might help. So you can see this part was peeled already, and when the holes start to appear, when they were stopping, they sort of folded on itself and glue it in this position instead of removing it. So they take the advantage of the material which was already released from the surface. However, you have also the places which are complete puzzle, where it's partly peeled, patch over, etc., etc. And that's all exactly confirm what I was trying to say. A lot of these repair is happening in big rush, because otherwise you ruin the whole thing. You have to put the patch, you have to fix what's happening. So here are some examples of the patches. That's a huge one. You can again see in this part, that's the unfinished peeling. And then they put the patch over. And this is the same in transmitted light, so you can nicely see the silhouette of the shape of the patch and how it looked like from the hair side. And I believe that these two images clearly document that you can't make a nice little shape for the patch. They just rushed and placed whatever they could grab. So very often, by the way, it has a triangle shape. And I found out that that's the best shape when you grab with the 3 fingers, you can nicely place it down. And as soon as you place the epidermis layer back, It's glued immediately, and you just smooth the edges with the bone folder. You remove nothing, just leave it dry immediately. And because, as I mentioned, it's so thin parchment, it literally dries in minutes, which is complete opposite with the calf parchment, which is a totally different method of the process, because when the calf parchment dry on the frame, you only start the actual process of the parchment making by reducing the thickness in the dry stage with different shave, as we could see in the cowlies, right? Shaving first, and then pouncing with the pumice, etc. It's a totally different technology. Anyway, here is some other patch. You can see that, of course, there was even written over the patch. And I think I should, in the end, turn the attention to actual animal. So I will show you one skin I have processed. I have to say this one is rather small. It's a stillborn lamb, so as you will see, it's not exactly the size of the what we would expect in case of Washington Gospel. So first you have the fur, you have the hair. After lime, you dehair it, then you peel it, and then it looks like on both sides equal, right? And so if we look now, and it's so perfectly even, so there is hardly find any kind of navigation about the anatomy of the animal. The only thing which you can observe on some folios on their margin are already mentioned axillary, so meaning again armpits, belly, and so on. So you can see here is one. However, you can also see here is one. It's a different folio, of course. So that gives you the idea that the animal spine was running either vertically or horizontally. And that also gives you the idea how much of the bifolia you could produce from one skin. So this is the skin of 1-year-old lamb. And if I take the measurement, it's about 700 approximately to 700 millimeters, and that would give us about 5 bifolia of Washington Gospel. Now, the sheepskin is very tricky one because it, even during the process of the liming and then dehairing, get destroyed or partly, especially on the edges. So very often you manage to make incomplete skin. So you could easily only get 2 or, I don't know, 3 bifolia, not necessarily 5 or 4. But that would be probably the maximum, maybe in some cases 6. But you can see the shape of the sheepskin is like a pearl. It's kind of oblong. So neck, of course, is here. So you have not too much chances to get enough material here. Right. So to complete, I would say that there is still at least always some hope comes in the end. And we've been very pleased to find at least that we have one leg, which you can see here, and here in detail, and which also shows, because the legs are usually used for attachment to the frame, so you can also see the tension lines, how parchment was stretched. And as a bonus, we found also that there are some original hairs preserved, which were not removed in this area. So in the very end, I would mention the state of preservation. It was already mentioned. And you can see here that, of course, some of the edges of parchment on the margins are so heavily deteriorated that it can be hardly any hope to get some reasonable measurements from some scientific methods, including the proteomics, etc. It's simply heavily damaged, so there must be found the right places which these can help. And then, of course, we have this efflorescence, which was mentioned here, which is here, and there is some detail here. And that's what I also believe might be a really good hint to learn how the chemically was parchment processed. Because as I mentioned, I'm using the lime bath. However, it's only one of the 3 or maybe even more different methods how you can dehair the skin. And so these kind of salty crystals, if I can call it, might hopefully tell us more about the method of the wet part, specifically removal of the hair. So I put at the beginning the image of the logo of the Beast and Craft project, because that was the one I worked most of my research. However, I'm now attached to these 2 different European projects. One is about the Insular manuscripts, the other one is about the fragment in Scandinavian manuscripts. So there is a lot to do. And I'm really pleased that the scientists and general scholars, I mean the history scholars and manuscript scholars, finally get really attracted by the parchment. Thank you very much.
So we now have a short time of questions and answers, and there are 2 runners who will be going through. If you raise your hands, we can take some questions for the various speakers. So hopefully based on the topics of the talks today, because there's so many things you could ask about the Washington Gospels. So please.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for a lovely presentation. I had no idea that it was made out of lambskin, so thank you. What was the ink made of? It was so beautiful and well preserved. I don't know if you covered the ink.
I'll say that's one of the questions that will be worked on in the future.
Thank you all for your wonderful talks. I have a question for Dr. Vnouček or any of you who want to comment. But as I was looking at the images, I noticed that it seemed that one of the areas that had a patch over it, it was like the scribe had had written over it, and it was really faded. I'm wondering if that was a common thing that the scribe would try to do, is try to write over the patches, or if the scribe would try to write around them, since it seems like a more fragile area.
Well, does it work? Yes. As I mentioned previously, this is really different scribal practice, because the patches were there before the parchment gets to the scribes. While if you look in the most of the medieval manuscripts, specifically one written on calf parchment, or if you like, vellum, the scribes usually avoid the holes, or they also include some patches. But this is really, honestly, everything ready-made, and they just wrote over.
Dr. Vnouček, what happens if you don't patch the hole? If you don't patch the hole, what happens when you're making parchment?
Well, yeah. Okay, well, this is a really good question. Well, there are 2 things to mention. First of all, as I mentioned, this tissue, if I can call it like this, epidermis tissue, is so thin that if you make a wrong move, you get a tiny little ball which just disappear. Because it's really like, you have to be extremely careful to hold it. And if it happens that you don't catch the hole, you very often get the wrong running tears through the whole parchment. Because especially at the edge, it's like a start for the, maybe not completely through the whole skin, but it's sort of damaging your product in a very big way.
Hi. Questions from online. There's a question about the parchment that was used. You mentioned earlier that there was proposed sheep and goat. Did you find any goat in the current study?
Well, the sheep and goat is tricky, I have to say, and I'm doing the visual analysis. And I would never dare to distinguish between goat and sheep only on, let's say, hair follicle pattern and something. But the Washington Gospel have no hair follicle pattern visible, which actually is a kind of characteristics of the sheep as well. And then, of course, you have the actual process. The idea, which is mentioned in the facsimile, is because the colors were white nicely on both sides, while some other ones were more yellowish on the hair side than on the flesh side. And I believe that's because there are also different parts of the manuscripts, and actually the John is a sort of addition or a different part. So that there are simply different batches of production. And also, and that's very important to mention, there are different breeds of animals. So some of them, I can guarantee you, some of the sheepskin you can't just simply use because the skin is so fat that even if you repeatedly lime it, you can't just simply use it. So I would much more expect it's all sheep, however, slightly differences between simply production batches. But I believe this might be possible to solve with the proteomic analysis in the future, hopefully, this problem. So, but sheep.
Well, first, thank you for undertaking this very important research project. I think it will yield great benefits for gospel scholarship and paleographical studies. If I may ask two quick questions. First, Rhea, do you expect the stereo imaging to reveal the erasures in portions of the manuscript? I'm thinking especially of that potentially erased choir number for the first choir of the Gospel of John, and then the colophon at the end of the Gospel of Mark that may be helpful for tracing the history of the manuscript.
We will see, but I mean, there is a chance. I mean, that's what we're going to be trying out to see what we can reveal with it. I mean, we have done some preliminary imaging, but we were not able to reveal anything through that. And we will have to see with the photometric imaging if that will help us.
And then also on the parchment, did you observe any indication of greater deterioration in the parchment of that first choir of the Gospel of John compared to the remainder of the manuscript? Henry Sanders, the original researcher, said that it was significantly more deteriorated.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't feel like, for me, it looks, well, of course, the yellow, I believe, honestly, that, as I already said a little bit before, that the color is much more given by the process and is there right from the beginning. What is deterioration was what I was showing in the last images, which comes from the heat and other kind of weather, whatever influence. But I would just much more think it's simply different skin. And one of the things I should mention, because you ask actually a very good question to Rhea, is that we also hope that with the multispectral imaging, we would be able to distinguish between the different types of parchments. I mean, the different surfaces. And we also believe that's our kind of dream job, which might not probably happen because it would be just almost miracle, that we would be able to match some of the folia back into the size of the skin. But I don't believe that because this is extremely tricky in this case. It's much more easier with other type of processes. So, but I think the multispectral might also help with this.
First of all, thank you for those really fascinating presentations. Having heard them and having seen the slides, now I find myself sitting here wishing I could actually see the Codex. So I'm wondering whether the museum has any plans to exhibit it at some point in the future.
Would you like to field this one?
I rely upon the expertise of my colleagues. So it's a perfectly reasonable question. Our first order of business is to do no harm. Our first order of business is to preserve. The work that colleagues are doing, they can do precisely because previous generations have been so conservative in their approach. So in an ideal world, or perhaps even in the less than ideal world in which we live, that would be a desideratum, and we'll do it if it is possible. But I think there's some degree of skepticism. May I abuse my possession of the microphone right now for a moment? Because I've forgotten. I think at some point Jiří told me an answer to this question, but I've completely forgotten. And I know it's on most everyone's mind, which is that if you assume, say, 4 bifolios per sheep, how many sheep gave their lives for the Washington Codex? And there's an entire economic history, of course, that can be written, we can think about this as an object. In which it's the acquisition sheep and a related question, how long did it take you to acquire the skills to handle the skin? And so what degree of expertise is required? I'm getting at just the manufacture, the cost of manufacture.
Right, so first of all, I haven't mentioned that, but as you could notice, we are quite anxious about these axillas. And every sheep have 2 major ones at the belly. So we just discussed these couple days when I'm here observing the actual parchment, that it would be a good idea to count how many there are and see how many bifolia doesn't have anything. And if I'm not wrong, we get the number like 25 sheeps, because it's very approximate, I have to say. It's like, how do you are experts in the cowboys, how they shoot without preparation, you know. So this is kind of, I can't really be 100% sure. So, but clearly, it might be surprising for you, it's not a big number, but that's because of the size. So we've been expected, as I shown, like 5 bifolia from one skin. And so very quick statistic, very quick mathematic told us this. Don't take it so seriously, but I wouldn't be surprised the number would be completely different. Now, the second part of the question is very interesting because, when Rhea said that she's hoping I will produce some skin for the haptic or whatever to show, I'm a bit embarrassed about that because, I've done quite a lot of skins of this type. Some of them were used for mock-ups for the Vienna Genesis examination, etc., etc. However, it's extremely tricky business, and I forget to say that. I really can't imagine how they did it in the big scale. And I can only understand it was because the slaves and cheap labor and simply having the possibilities. And most important to mention that we are really speaking about the period of the late Antiquity. And then this parchment completely disappeared. It's hard to say whether it was with the fall of the Rome, but because some of the practices always survive for some years, if not 1 century maybe, as it would be in this case. However, at the 8th century, we are speaking about sheep only, entering completely different methods, kind of, as I like to call it, transition period, when the parchments start to be, sheep parchment, again I have to say, start to be prepared completely different way, and believe me, it looked very weird. So it's a kind of lost skill, and it's very interesting, and I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but it only helped me, or I've been successful to find these things when I was looking at some very late antiquities in Vatican, and they've been so imperfect. This codex is perfect. There are some, of course, for the slideshow and this talk, I have picked up the things, but there are few literary. I couldn't maybe show you more or dramatically more, but in the whole codex. So there are folia which are completely perfect. But there exist the codices which have a lot of imperfection, and that's the way how to learn it. Sorry about that.
Okay, we had one more down front.
Do we have any information about the ink?
As we said, we will be doing analysis of the ink. That has not yet been done.
Okay, so at this point, we really don't know anything.
I don't have it off the top of my head.
Stay tuned, it's coming.
I did have one that had come in for Chase about the monasteries and the history. You mentioned several monasteries. Is there anything known about the histories of the monasteries that would add to the context of the manuscript, in general?
I think the answer is yes, although I think the answer is yes, but I'm inclined to think not that much. I think my own impression, and I would defer to those who know this tradition better than I, and you are legion compared to me, is that the evidence for this particular manuscript locating its origin is probably fruitless. There's nothing but probabilities at best. Of course, to some extent, the production history, the economic history of monasteries in late antiquity is an active field of research. But of course, what Jiří demonstrates is the enormous heuristic utility of and what one can learn from approximating manufacture, and so far as I'm aware, nothing rivals that. I could be wrong, stand to be corrected in terms of kind of detail.
One more question.
Thank you guys so much for these fascinating presentations. Speaking as one of the scientists who is also very interested in parchment, what ideas do you have for studying the efflorescence? Would it be infrared, X-ray based?
So we have started with a little bit of FTIR, so infrared spectroscopy, and the next is to look with SEM or XRF to see if there's calcium in it, to see if it could be indicative of a Lyme. But Jennifer, one of our chemists who did the FTIR, says no, it's not Lyme. So we'll have to find out. Other techniques will be then used.
Awesome, thank you.
And that will be the last question then. I hope that you will join us upstairs to continue the conversation with the speakers at a reception. Thank you very much for coming today.